Good morning. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Gary Cohen, and I'm one of ScreenSafe's founders. On behalf of ScreenSafe, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on marijuana in the workplace. This morning, you will hear from two industry thought leaders, Bill Heffernan, co-founder of ScreenSafe, and Lucy Manos, ScreenSafe's vice president of operations. So today, we're going to talk to you about who ScreenSafe is, marijuana general information, marijuana as medicine, signs and symptoms of use, their current research, the ways that marijuana is tested for, Illinois law, and then we'll have closing comments. Since 2000, we've offered a variety of personalized drug-free workplace services to employers who are committed to preventing the harmful consequences caused by the misuse of alcohol and the use of illicit drugs. In 2001, one of the first organizations we worked with to develop a policy and subsequently implement a drug-free workplace program for was given an award of special recognition by the Executive Office of the President, Office of National Drug Control Policy. So in terms of creating your drug-free workplace, creating a policy that's consistent with your organization's goals, we will help you develop customized protocols. We conduct supervisory training, employee education and awareness. We also set up a random selection program for you, and we have multiple collection sites across the country, and we only use certified laboratories to do the testing on our behalf. We also secure the services of a licensed physicians who are certified medical review officers, and they review all non-negative tests that come about when people take a test. We do the data management for you, and we provide you with compliance reporting so you know if people are complying with the program. We securely communicate with you any test results if somebody is available for work or not available for work. And we're available 24 hours a day for reasonable suspicion and post-accident testing. We also have an interactive website linked to current information on drug testing. And more important, and one of the more important issues that we have, especially for multi-employer groups, is that we can set up a reciprocity website for you so that you don't have to keep testing the same persons over and over again if they sign in from one company to another. It's with great pleasure that I now get to introduce you to Bill Heffernan, and I hope you enjoy our webinar today. And thank you again for participating.
Okay, so let me just say again, I'm Bill Heffernan. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. Many of you I know for many years through my role at Employee Resource Systems, a company that Gary and I led for 27 years. I'm very excited to talk to you today about the marijuana issue. It is something that I feel like it's a train that's coming down the track. There's not much we can do about that, but we have to be smart in the workplace if we want to maintain a safe and effective workforce. So by the end of today's session, it is my hope that you'll be able to list some of the essential component parts of marijuana and talk about their effects. I hope that you'll be able to talk about the detection versus impairment paradox that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Ideally, I want to make sure that you know some of the signs and symptoms of a user so that you know how to respond if you have somebody in your workforce who is impaired and may represent a risk to the safety of the workforce. And then I'm going to leave it to Lucy. And Lucy, as you all know, or many of you know, has a tremendous amount of experience in administering these policies and working with our clients and our organizations that we serve to identify some key issues for your organization regarding your policy, and also to talk about how to deal with reasonable suspicion issues when they come up. So really quickly, just kind of a slight diversion. This is a chart that shows you the tax revenues collected by the state of Illinois over the last period of time. And you can see the green line, aptly enough, is marijuana. The brown line is alcohol. And what you, I hope, discern from this slide is the fact that marijuana sales, the revenues generated by marijuana sales have just shot through the roof. Now, it's important to recognize that this will not go on forever. The marijuana, as more states legalize marijuana, as medical and recreational marijuana becomes more common, the revenues in Illinois will continue to go up. At some point, they'll plateau because people will be buying their marijuana in their own states. As an example, this past July, we broke all records with marijuana sales in Illinois, with recreational marijuana sales. Illinois residents bought $85 million worth of marijuana in July, but out-of-state residents bought $42 million worth of marijuana. And some of that, much of that was pushed by Lollapalooza. So a lot of people coming into the state in order to have a more fulsome Lollapalooza experience went ahead and purchased some marijuana here. And, and we appreciate their tax revenue, but, what's going to happen over time is the revenues will plateau, they'll peak, they'll plateau, and then as competition increases, the tax revenues will likely start to descend, at least to some extent. And so it's just a cautionary, it's a cautionary note, because what will typically happen is people get used to having all this money, and then it's going to start to decline at least a little bit. Now, at this point in time, about 350,000 Americans work in the marijuana industry. So it's a huge industry. And it is estimated that, the first 6 months of marijuana sales in Illinois, we generated almost $53 million in tax revenue. During the last 12 months, we've generated $317 million. So the numbers are just astronomical, and that will continue for at least the foreseeable future. Now, marijuana has been around for thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years. The marijuana plant contains over 480 different chemical compounds. There are, depending on where you read it, there are between 60 and 140 different cannabinoids in marijuana. The two most commonly known cannabinoids are delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol and then CBD or cannabidiol. Those are the ones that everyone knows about, everyone hears about. But there are also in cannabis, there's terpenes, and there's a variety of terpenes. They add the smell and the flavor to the different types of marijuana that people will buy. As a part of preparing for this presentation, I visited a bunch of dispensaries, and it was really a kick. And one of the people at the dispensary was telling me about, THC is the car, but the terpenes are the driver. They determine the experience. So that wasn't, certainly an interesting kind of interaction or dialogue I had with him. So again, marijuana has been used medically for the last 2,500 years. There are two commonly talked about types of marijuana. There's sativa, cannabis sativa, which is supposed to give you more of an energetic and euphoric high. And then there's indica, and the way someone explained it to me is indica is another, the colloquial way of saying indica is in the couch. Because when you smoke indica marijuana strains, you will have a hard time getting out of the couch. So you're in the couch. If you talk to botanists, they'll say, listen, these are not two different strains. Sativa is one strain and indica is a substrain of that same strain. But none of that matters to someone who is using or experimenting with marijuana. Again, as I mentioned, it's been used for years for medical purposes. It's documented in ancient Chinese literature. It was used in the 1800s. It's been around for a long time. It's been found in some of the burial sites in Egypt. So this is a chemical that's been around for a long time. In the 1970s, marijuana was made a Schedule I drug, which means that the federal government identified it as a drug that has no legal or useful medical purpose. In the 1990s, scientists discovered that the body of all vertebrates have an endocannabinoid system, or ECS. It's a system that's spread out through your body. You can see from the chart that there's a heavy concentration of what's referred to as CB1 receptors in your brain and in your central nervous system. The CB2 receptors are in your immune system and some of your peripheral organs. And what we know is there are endogenous cannabinoids made in your body. Anandamide is one of them. There are a couple of really common ones, and those interact with the endocannabinoid system to have an effect, right? To make you feel certain ways and and in many cases, they're neuroprotective. They're protective of the system. But there's also exogenous cannabinoids that come from outside of your body, like delta-9 THC, like CBD, and some of the other cannabinoids. And there are so many different cannabinoids. As I mentioned, there's at least 100 that we know of: CBN, CBG, CBC. So there's just a ton of different cannabinoids, and we don't fully understand how the system works and how these different cannabinoids work. And one of the reasons we don't understand that is because doing research on cannabis in this country is really hard. So if I'm a professor at a university and I go to my academic institution, they say, listen, I want to do cannabis research. The legal counsel at that university is going to say, no way, or they're going to really take a slow walk it through the process, because the Drug-Free Workplace Act from the 80s, the Drug-Free Schools and Community Act from the 80s, both are clear that if you violate the act and you get federal funding, you lose your federal funding. So the universities are loath to put themselves in a position where they might lose their funding. In addition, if I want to do research on cannabis, on a Schedule I drug, in this case cannabis, I have to get a Schedule I license from the Drug Enforcement Administration. The specifications, the requirements to get that level of Schedule I license are onerous, they're difficult, they're challenging. And then if I do get that license, I then have to get permission or approval from the FDA for my research project. And if I get approval from the FDA, then I have to run it through my institutional review board at the university, the IRB, to get their approval. And then I have to go back to NIH, the National Institute on Health, NIH, and say, listen, I got approval. Can I now have some money to do this research? So it's a huge process. It's very complicated. So a lot of universities have just thrown up their hands. Some of the universities are doing interesting work to get around that process. If I do get all that approval, if I do go through that whole process, then the marijuana that I get comes from a farm in Oxford, Mississippi. The government has a farm where they grow marijuana. But the marijuana that's grown on the farm in Oxford, Mississippi, does not reflect the kind of marijuana people can buy at any dispensary. So I might get a package of joints from the farm in Mississippi, but they might have a THC level of 6 or 10%, nothing compared to the 20, 30% THC that I'm getting at the local dispensary, or the concentrates that are 90 or 95% pure. So there's a total disconnect between the research, how applicable the research is to our current experience. Marijuana gets used in a variety of forms. We'll talk about those forms really quickly, but also on the right-hand side of this chart, you see that in the 70s, marijuana had a THC level of 1% perhaps, right? And so when someone says this is a natural substance, we should be okay because it's natural. In the 70s, it might have been natural. What people are buying today is in no way natural. In the old days, it took 6 to 7 months to grow a marijuana plant. Now, 3 months. Grow lights, pesticides, fertilizers. There's just an entire process that takes us from being a natural substance to something that has been really changed dramatically. You can smoke it. You can have the oral solutions where you have a spray that you put into your mouth, or a sublingual tincture you put in under your tongue. You can have the edibles, the candy, the brownie, and then there's also topical solutions that people put on to help manage their pain. But again, on the right-hand side, you can see that cannabis is 10 to 20% delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. Medical grade could be greater than 30%, and then the concentrates are just crazy. So concentrates come in a variety of forms. You can see some of them on the side. Shatter is a common one. But when you're using these concentrates, you heat them up in a variety of ways, and then they vaporize and you suck it at the smoke or the vapor into your lungs. Now, the highlighted text there has to do with vaporization. If someone is using vaporized THC on your work site, you will have no idea, because the vape pen looks like any other vape pen. There's not a smell attached to it. So someone could be getting high on your job site and you would have no idea. With vaporization, the THC is heated up to 160 to 230 degrees. It vaporizes and you suck it into your lungs and it immediately goes into your bloodstream. You can smoke marijuana. When you smoke marijuana, the marijuana is heated to 600 to 900 degrees. It ignites, it burns. You are basically sucking in hydrocarbons. It can irritate your lungs. It can cause bronchitis. Both of those things get better over time once you stop using. And then let's talk about the paradox. If I smoke a marijuana joint, I'm going to get high and I'm going to have a pretty short feedback loop. I'll smoke a joint, I'll start to feel something. I can smoke more and get more affected, smoke less and not get more affected. And it immediately shows up in my bloodstream, right? So there's a high level of THC in my bloodstream. The THC level drops pretty dramatically, quickly, but the impairment levels don't. So let me show you that on the next chart. So here you can see the pink line is the THC concentration in your bloodstream, and it goes up and it drops dramatically. And it stay by an hour and a half, 2.5 hours later, it's very low level. But the impairment level, the performance impairment, as the green line shows, continues to exist and kind of stays stable. And then the subjective experience of being high continues well past the time at which it's detectable in the bloodstream at any significant level. So you're getting the levels in your system are dropping, your experience of being high is going up and then staying up. And that's the conundrum we face with workplace safety is someone could literally show up in your job or, drive in the mornings. And this takes me back to the late 1980s when I was working in this field initially, when people used to drive to work and get high on their way to work. And we're going to find ourselves in a similar position, I fear, at least in some cases. Marijuana edibles have been around for a very long time. In 1954, Alice Toklas, who was the life partner of Gertrude Stein, wrote a memoir about her life, and it was a memoir / cookbook, not typical, but she had a recipe for hashish fudge in the cookbook, and it was one of the more modern people talking about using edibles. The first time it was occurred in the more modern time. And she talked about how it made parties so much more interesting and so much more fun because people would have fits of laughter and they'd be thinking at all these different levels. And then you can see some of the other common edibles. Now, I'll talk about this in a second, but you can see if I'm buying edibles because I don't like to smoke and I don't like to vape, and the edible is a cookie, the edible is a brownie, or the edible is one of these candies. If I leave this on the counter at home and a kid picks this up, they're not going to know that having one piece of candy is the dose. They're not going to know that having 1/4 of a cookie is the dose. They're not going to know that 1/8 of the brownie is the dose. And actually, I have an adult friend who has a medical marijuana card. He bought the brownies, had them in his freezer. His wife didn't know the brownies that were in the freezer were marijuana brownies. And she had a really horrible experience because she took the brownies out of the freezer, was like, oh, this is great, was having some coffee in her brownies. And she just felt completely out of control and was very upset that she had done this. And it's really easy to see how that happens. And I'll show you a couple of pieces of information about that in a second. Now, the challenge with marijuana is that if you're going to eat it, when you consume it, it goes through your liver, and your liver converts the THC to 11-hydroxy THC, which is more potent. So the experience might be a little more intense. And the other thing that has been happening is that someone might buy an edible. They eat the edible, maybe it's a 5 milligram or 10 milligram THC edible, and they wait 15 or 20 minutes, nothing happens. And they're like, well, this is a ripoff, what's going on? So they take a second one. And now they've got 10 or 20 milligrams of THC on board, and still nothing's happening. So what the heck? So now I take a third one. Now I've got 15 to 30 milligrams of THC on board, and then it hits. And now I'm really just toasted. And I don't know who I am. I don't know where I am. There was an article, or one of the pieces I read about, there was a New York Times reporter by the name of Maureen Dowd who went out to Colorado to check into the marijuana experience there. And she was a naive user, didn't know much. No one explained to her how this process works. And she ate an edible with a huge dose of THC and described being curled up in her hotel room bed for the entire night, afraid to move, unable to move, because she didn't know what was happening to her. And that's not an uncommon experience. Now, a lot of the research that I've read, and I've read a fair bit, talks about the fact that if you're using medical marijuana, you should not, if you're smoking it, you should not do anything safety sensitive for at least 4 hours after use. If you're using an edible, you should not do anything safety sensitive for at least 6 to 8 hours after using the edible product. And the 8 hours is if you experience any level of being high, then you should definitely not do anything safety sensitive for up to 8 hours. Now, I want to just point out that's for the medical substances. We don't have research on how long someone's impaired if they're using a high dose. If I'm taking a medical marijuana pill or gummy that maybe has 2.5 THC or 5 milligrams of THC, that's dramatically different from me smoking a joint that's 20% THC. So we don't have a ton of research on how long after someone uses the higher doses that will affect their ability to perform their duties safely and effectively. Now, if you go to some of the different states and you look at their websites, Washington has a great website with lots of information. The state of Washington, the state of Colorado has a great website with a lot of really good information about marijuana and their state's experience and the research that's being paid for and done by the state, their legal issues, the car accidents, the tickets, the DUIs, the driving while impaired. The state of Illinois has a newsletter on their website that was published last year in July, so over a year ago, and that's it. Very little information on the state of Illinois' website. And I think that's unfortunate because there's just a ton that we as employers should know, particularly as we have people who are safety sensitive. So here you have on the state of Washington's website some information on the poison control experience for 2019 and 2020. And you can see 0 to 5-year-olds, 122 calls to the Poison Control Center about somebody eating cannabis product. And then it goes up with the 21 to 59-year-old. And a lot of those, I suspect, are people who are naive, who got impatient, used too much. Marijuana as medicine, there are a lot of ways that marijuana has been used historically as medicine in other countries where it is used as medicine. There are a variety, like Epidiolex. Many of you have probably heard about people using that for 2 different types of severe seizure disorders. That's available in the United States. Marinol has been around for a very long time. It's a synthetic THC that is used for nausea and vomiting, may be helpful with pain. Nabilone is also, and I'm not sure I'm saying that properly, is also known as Sativex or Sativex, depending on how you say that again. And typically that's used for nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy and cancer. It's also off-label used for pain. The National Academy of Sciences did a thorough review. It's an enormous book I have right here, where they looked at the effectiveness of these different substances, and they found that oral cannabinoids could be helpful as an anti-nausea drug, anti-vomiting drug. They found that some of the cannabinoids can be helpful with pain symptoms, and they also found that with spasticity disorders like MS, some of the different CBD products and THC products can be helpful with spasticity as well. Oh, I just want to mention real quickly, I'm sorry. You can see that in 1909, Eli Lilly had its marijuana products. So the bottle was from 1909. The box of, what is that, 1/4 pound, 1/4 pound of solid extract of cannabis, Americana. So those are medications that were available in the early 1900s. Marijuana really didn't become illegal in the States until about 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act. The cannabis use disorders, the DSM-5, the Bible of the psychiatric profession, says that if you have 2 or 3 of the criteria listed here, you have a mild disorder. If you have 4 to 5, you have a moderate disorder. If you have 6 or more of the criteria listed here, then you have a severe cannabis use disorder. Now, I know that some people feel like no one can become addicted to cannabis. I would venture to disagree. Anyone who's on the call who knows me knows that I spent 4 years running an adolescent drug treatment center. We got kids who were there because of their cannabis use. Both Gary and I spent time running adult treatment centers, and we had the experience of working with people whose lives had spun out of control because of their cannabis use. The frequency or the prevalence of developing a cannabis use disorder for adults is about 9%. It typically peaks in your 20s. It's more commonly associated with men than women. So typically it's about 10% of the population, peaks in the 20s. It's mostly men. The risk of someone who starts using marijuana in their 60s developing a cannabis use disorder is fairly low. The 17% that's on this chart speaks to the fact that if young people, before your brain doesn't finish developing until you're in your 24th or 25th year, if you begin to use marijuana or use marijuana heavily, your risk of developing a cannabis use disorder increases dramatically. From 15 to 17% of the people who start using younger may develop a cannabis use disorder. Now, you've probably seen or heard stories about people becoming psychotic, developing schizophrenia. There is a body of research that starts to speak to the fact that if you have a family history of mental health disorders, if you have a family history of psychiatric disorders, and you start to use cannabis at a younger age in your teens, the risk for that facilitating the evolution of your mental health condition, there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that's possible. And again, I'm not into the big whole, scared straight thing. This is just information people need to have. So if you have a family history of psychiatric illness and you have kids, you need to talk to them about the risk of developing those problems. Now, when you compare marijuana to the other substances, alcohol use disorders prevalence is 16% of the population who uses alcohol will develop an alcohol use disorder. 24% of the people who use heroin will develop a heroin use disorder. And then the big one, nicotine, 32% of the people who use nicotine will develop a nicotine use disorder or an addiction to nicotine. Withdrawal from cannabis is not terrible, except for the people around the person withdrawing. So someone who's withdrawing from cannabis, they're going to be irritable. They're going to be short-tempered. They're going to have a hard time sleeping. They may have some problems with their eating. They're going to feel nauseous. The chill they got from smoking weed or using marijuana has been taken away. And it'll take my experience, particularly with teenagers, was it was generally about 7 to 10 days before everything leveled off completely. So, where they just kind of got back to baseline. So when who's a heavy regular smoker or user of marijuana, one of the guys I met at the dispensary said, "Oh, I've been getting high for 14 years. I work at the dispensary because I get my weed for free." If he were to stop, he would probably be fairly unpleasant to be around for a good 2 weeks, would be my guess. But, it's again related to the frequency and quantity of marijuana that you're using. The effects of marijuana: short-term memories impact, impaired motor coordination, increased heart rate. Again, your heart has CB1 receptors. So when you're smoking or using marijuana, the CB1 receptors are activated, causes the heart rate to increase. There's been a couple of studies about the increased risk of heart attack when someone's using marijuana. One study, not conclusive. The other study sample was too small. I would not say those were persuasive studies, but it is clear it does cause your heart rate to increase. Beyond that, anything else would be more speculation. It can alter your judgment, make you engage in risky behavior. In high doses, again, in those high doses, it can cause people to feel very much out of control. It can cause, in some cases, psychosis and paranoia, obviously paranoia. Symptoms of use: there is a Netflix series about marijuana that I really like, and this is a picture of the guy from that show. Again, your eyes have CB1 receptors. So even if you're if you're eating it or you're vaporizing it, your CB1 receptors will be activated. It will cause the blood flow to increase in your eye. The blood will pool in the blood vessels, and it will cause you to have bloodshot eyes, even if you're not smoking it. Because a lot of people think, oh, the bloodshot eyes are from smoking. Not at all. It's from the effect of the CB1 receptors and their location in your body. It may change your mood. Some people may feel less anxious, although the research I've read, the research that has been done on the use of marijuana to help with anxiety is not convincing. It's not persuasive in terms of its efficacy. And in some cases, particularly for people who like to feel in control, using marijuana does not help them feel less anxious. Actually, people who like to feel in control and they use marijuana don't like the effect it has for them. It may reduce some people's inhibitions. It may cause sleepiness or fatigue. The big issue for me in the context of the workplace is the fact that you have distorted perceptions of space and time. People who are high are not good at judging distance. People who are high are not good at judging time. So when you say to someone, in 3 minutes, let me know X, Y, or Z, the person who's high, might say, well, why didn't you let me know? Oh gosh, has it been 3 minutes? I thought it was like 5 seconds. It's just, you're not good at judging time when you're high. It may cause problem solving. It changes or affects your executive functioning. So you're not as able to multitask. You're not as able to problem solve. Again, if you're a heavy smoker, it may cause bronchitis or other lung issues. They get better over time. They get better when you stop. It may alter your appetite. And it's really interesting because the effect on the appetite is because of the CB1 receptors in your thalamus and your brain, and the cascading effects on the different neurons in your brain. And then for some people who are using a lot or frequently, they may experience paranoia. So here's a study that was done by a group called Instamotor, where they asked people about their use of marijuana. And nearly half of the marijuana users have gone to work high, about almost 40% of them once a week, 17% once a month. And then when you talk about people in management positions, ADP of Canada did a study. 500 of the 1,000 people involved in the study were managers, and 14% of them said they were likely to use at work, and 20% of them said they were likely to get high before they got to work. Not necessarily reassuring for someone who works in a safety sensitive industry. Now here's from Colorado's website. And I think the reason I included this is just because it highlights the fact that the more people use, the more frequently they use, the less problematic they think it is. And the more comfortable they are, as this slide demonstrates, in this case, driving. And I've talked to many people over the years who said, when I'm a little high, I'm a really good driver. I'm a better driver. And my reaction to that is, probably not. You're just not as aware of the things you're doing that are problematic as you might be if you weren't high. Marijuana affects your driving. It slows down your reaction time. It affects your executive functioning, so your ability to pay attention to multiple things at one time. I'm sure we've all seen a movie or show where someone who's high gets distracted by the radio, and then they're just looking at the radio as opposed to the road in front of them. And then your position in your lane tends to change more often. And they use very sophisticated equipment, simulators to test this. Here are a number of studies and citations that talk about the effect of marijuana on driving: decreased divided attention, impaired executive functioning, impaired road tracking. Now, one of the things that, I'm so sorry, I got ahead of myself. One of the things that we do know is that when you compare driving drunk to driving when you're high, people who are drunk will drive at different speeds, and they'll speed more often. People who are high will drive at a consistent speed and go slower. People who are drunk will drive typically more aggressively and maybe closer to the person in front of them, whereas people who are high follow at a greater distance. In two large European studies, they found with drivers with THC in their blood were roughly twice as likely to be culpable in a fatal car accident. The challenge, the issue here is it's really hard to separate out marijuana only and marijuana and alcohol. Clearly, if someone is one or the other, they're less of a risk than if they're both. So if I've been drinking and using marijuana, my safety profile goes down dramatically. If I'm doing one or the other, it's not good anyway, but it's not as bad as it is with the combination. If you go online and look for information on how to go to work high and not get caught, there's a ton of information. It's fascinating. And so, I would use that in reverse and say, here's some information about, this is what people who are coming to work high are going to be doing. Just try to not get detected. If you're interested in finding out more, if you're a pro-marijuana person, then you want to visit the NORML website, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. If you're an anti-marijuana person, then you want to check into something like Smart Approaches to Marijuana, or SAM, which is an organization that's run by one of the former White House drug policy people. My challenge with this is that we're moving very quickly with something we know very little about. And the research on this substance is not good. The background isn't, the base of information is not great, but we're charging ahead anyway. And where you don't have good information, as we've all seen over the last couple of years, where you don't have good, sound scientific information, that void gets filled up by marketing and other stuff. So that's my challenge here is, how do we keep our workplaces safe, and how do we move forward with this process in a way that makes sense? So let me turn this over to Lucy. Lucy, as some of you know, has been with ScreenSafe for 18 years. She has literally dealt with every imaginable situation you can conceive of. She's phenomenal. She has just a load of information and a load of resources available to folks. So Lucy, it's all yours.
Hi, thank you. So I get the fun part of talking about drug testing and then also the Illinois law. So I can tell you, when I'm talking about drug testing, particularly marijuana impairment, that this will be a quick section because currently there's nothing out there that can test for impairment for marijuana. We recently spoke to one of the labs that is working on a marijuana breathalyzer. They said they are currently being tested and they're expected to be in production by the end of 2021 and early 2022. The thing with that is we're still not really sure when it's going to be readily available, when it will be in collection facilities that anybody can go to and use and test for. So I think that's a little bit further down the line before we really have access to that on a regular basis, but it is definitely in the works. Now, the thing with marijuana breathalyzer that is what we're looking for is in different studies, they're showing that it can be detected in about 2 to 4 hours from use. And that's kind of a key time that we're looking for. Is somebody impaired now? Not did they do it yesterday, not did they do it a month ago, not did they do it 3 months ago, like with hair, but are they currently under the influence? And so I believe once we get that out there, it'll be very similar to a breath alcohol test, and you'll be able to get that information to say that, yes, somebody is under the influence. But again, I think we're a little further out than people are hoping for. So Illinois law, we're going to be talking about 410 of the Illinois Compiled Statute 705, Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act that was enacted January 1st of 2020. Now, we are not lawyers. I am not claiming to be a lawyer. I don't play one on TV, but we do believe, after talking with multiple lawyers on both sides of the argument, that if you have a reasonable zero tolerance or drug-free policy and it is applied in a reasonable and non-discriminatory way, you can continue with your program. And non-discriminatory is the big part there. You have to make sure, if you have a policy and you're testing, that it is done in a non-discriminatory way across the board, firm, fair, and consistent, and everyone is treated the same. Now, when this bill was originally signed in June of 2019 by Governor Pritzker, there was a lot of contradicting information that was in there. And some of that related to the Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act. Well, a trailer bill was signed in December of 2019, and that addressed some of those contradictions. It addressed a lot of things, but we're going to focus on the Right to Privacy in the Workplace and then the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, Section 1050, which is the employment and employer liability sections. So Section 5 originally said, from the Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act, that discrimination for use of a lawful product was prohibited, period, end of story. What it added from the trailer bill was, except as otherwise specifically provided by law, including Section 1050 of the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. So now that kind of removes that right to privacy in the Workplace Act that we were so concerned about, because now they're giving that exception to say that, okay, now we're going to follow on to Section 1050 of the Employment and Employer Liability section. And what this section says is Part A says nothing in the act shall prohibit an employer from adopting a reasonable zero tolerance or drug-free workplace policies or employment policies concerning drug testing, smoking, consumption, storage, or use of cannabis in the workplace or while on call, provided the policy is applied in a non-discriminatory manner. Part B says nothing in the act shall require an employer to permit an employee to be under the influence of or use cannabis in the employer's workplace or while performing employees' jobs, duties, or while on call. So they're saying, if somebody is under the influence, you certainly don't have to deal with that. Nothing in the act shall limit or prevent an employer from disciplining an employee or terminating employment of an employee for violating an employer's employment policies or workplace drug policy. And that's a really important one there too, because they're saying nothing in this act is going to stop you as an employer from following your policy, whatever that may be. Part D discusses what to do with impairment, and there's a few things that are very specific that you need to make sure that are in your policies. One of them is to mention that the employer has a good faith belief that someone is impaired, and that the person or the employee manifests specific articulable symptoms while working that decrease or lessens their performance of their duties. So that means you have to see that. You have to observe it. You need to make sure that it's not just somebody told you and you're going to send them for a drug test and whatever that result comes back, you're going to use. You need to make sure that they're observed doing something that you believe they're under the influence now. The other note in this section is that the employee must be afforded a reasonable opportunity to contest the basis of that determination. Now, you can do that in a lot of ways, but just because you're giving them the opportunity to contest it doesn't mean you're changing how you're handling your policy. Giving someone that opportunity is sitting down with them and them saying that I don't do drugs, I never have done drugs, I don't understand how that came up positive. One option is we always suggest doing a split specimen, and this is why, because you can have them retest the other half of their sample. When they do that, they're going to retest the other half of the initial sample that they took. They can send it to a laboratory of their choice. In the state of Illinois, you can have the employee pay for it. Now, in other states, it's different, but in Illinois, you can make the employee pay for that retest of the same sample. And if that result comes back, as long as it's done at a certified laboratory the same, then that's the result that stands. The other thing, again, you can just have the conversation. You can note that conversation, put it in the file, and then be on your way and say, you understand that. However, I have a positive drug screen from the laboratory. This is our policy. This is the consequence of what happens in the policy for a positive test. And then you're able to say, I gave them the ability to contest that result. The other thing with reasonable suspicion is you want to make sure, again, that you don't leave that test result as the standalone thing that you're using for discipline or termination. You want to make sure that they were observed. And then a big thing is reasonable suspicion or for cause documentation. Write it down, write what you observed, how you decided to go forward with doing a reasonable suspicion test. And those things do need to be admitted or do need to be on hand in case there's an issue later on. Section or Part E of the employment liability section notes that nothing in the act shall be construed to create or imply a cause of action for any person against their employer. And this is an interesting section because it's saying, okay, we're telling you that this law wasn't created so that somebody can bring a cause of action against you. And these are the things that it applies to. Actions taken pursuant to an employer's reasonable workplace drug policy, including but not limited to subjecting an employer applicant to reasonable drug and alcohol testing, reasonable and non-discriminatory random drug testing. So right there, they're telling you that you can do that random portion. And discipline, termination of employment, or withdrawal of a job offer due to failure of a drug test. So that's a really important part there as well. 2 of that section addresses employees' use or possession in the workplace while performing job duties against the employer's policy. 3 addresses discipline or termination based on the belief of impairment. Again, making sure that it's addressed in your policy. And 4 is injury, loss, or liability to a third party if the employer neither knew nor had reason to know that the employee was impaired. The last parts of this entire section for employment and employer liability discuss that nothing changes regarding protections afforded by any other law, and it includes the Compassionate Use of Medical Cannabis Pilot Program Act or the Opioid Alternative Pilot Program. Now, I can tell you the same language, a reasonable, non-discriminatory drug testing program is the same language that's used in the Compassionate Use for Medical Cannabis Pilot Program Act. So they're very similar in what they're looking for. And in that program, you were allowed to have a drug testing program that included marijuana. G discusses federal, state, and local restrictions, meaning if you are part of Department of Transportation testing, if you are part of a state-funded project and it's a prevailing wage job that requires drug testing, those all include marijuana, and that will continue regardless of anything else. H defines workplace, and I defines on call. I'm going to put the link for this entire section of the law in the chat just so that you can review that if you want to, because I'm sure it's very fascinating for many of you. The Illinois Vehicle Code, this is another one that I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention. In the Illinois Vehicle Code, for Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, if you test at 5 nanograms in whole blood or 10 nanograms in any other bodily substance, meaning urine or saliva, that is considered impairment. And this is under the impairment section of the Illinois Vehicle Code, which means if you test at a level of 10 nanograms, you can be considered impaired. Now, when that happens, that means that they could be used against you for a DUI. Now, what's interesting about that is federal guidelines is 15 nanograms on a confirmed positive means that you're positive or under the influence or whatever they're looking at as far as that goes. But that means you can actually have more THC in your body under the federal guidelines than you can for the Illinois Vehicle Code, which is 10 nanograms. And again, I just wanted people to be aware of that because it's kind of interesting that they chose those numbers to use as opposed to going with federal guidelines. The last things I kind of want to say here is about reviewing your current policy. If you don't have a policy in place, we will certainly be happy to help you create one and to put one in place. But if you do have a policy, make sure that you review it and make sure these certain things that you really kind of look at and address and make sure that are in there. Ensure you have written drug policy that prohibits possession, use, sale, and distribution of marijuana and other illegal drugs. Update your drug policy to address the reasonable suspicion for cause and post-accident impairment according to those guidelines. Noting your good faith determination. Again, you have to observe it. You have to believe that person is impaired when you're going to have them take a reasonable suspicion or for cause test. Extending the policy if necessary to cover on-call workers. Updating your accident investigation policies, and adding policy provisions that spell out how employees may contest the basis for your determination of impairment. Now, I can tell you with the majority of our programs that we administer, the last page of the policy book has a letter in there that says how they can contest this, that they have 5 days from the date they were notified of either their positive drug screen from the medical review office or from ScreenSafe. They can send a certified check or money order to this address, and we will retest the other sample, the other half of their sample at a laboratory of their choice, as long as it's a certified laboratory. So that's in that in those policies. It's giving them the opportunity to contest that result. A big thing is to make sure you train your supervisors on how to evaluate impairment, including the things that are under the specific act, what they need to look for. And again, if you have reasonable suspicion paperwork, it's really good that you kind of follow that. And that kind of will bring you along in the process to make sure on what you're reviewing. And then decide whether you should update your reasonable accommodation policies considering an employee's off-duty use of medical marijuana. Now, in closing, I would like to say thank you, everyone, for joining us. We really do appreciate it. If you have any questions, make sure you put them in the chat. We are going to try to do some questions and answers here in the end and get any information that we can to you. But if we don't get around to it, if you put your email in there, you can let us know. We would appreciate it if you complete the survey at the end of this webinar. That's just going to give us some information. Let us know how we did. Let us know if there's other things you would like to know or other webinars you would like to have, and how you think in general that it went along. And of course, if you have any questions that you think about later after you leave here, you can certainly email or call one of us and we would be happy to help you. And that is what I have. Are we all back on?
We are.
Are there any questions?
We look in the chat room.
Gosh, I think we did such a phenomenal job. There are no questions.
Yeah, I don't see any in the chat.
So one of the things that Lucy talked about was the fact that in Illinois, the blood level is 5 nanograms per milliliter, and the any bodily fluid is 10 nanograms per milliliter. It's important that you understand that there is no correlation between the presence of THC in someone's system and their level of impairment. So if I'm an inexperienced user and have used, I could have 5 nanograms in my system and just be high as a kite. If I'm an experienced user and I have 5 nanograms in my system, the guy I met at the dispensary who's been smoking to get high for 14 years, I am certain that his blood level of THC is well above 10 nanograms per milliliter. But I would suspect that if you ran into him at the store, you just would think he was a pretty laid back guy. So that's the challenge, is, there is currently no way to discern that. The other thing I will mention is that, Lucy intimated that Lucy, Gary, and I spoke to the folks at Hound Labs recently, and their testing technology have a base unit, they have a handheld unit that goes with the base unit, and then there are cartridges that go into the handheld unit. The the thing that is a little worrisome about that is that the unit is $10,000 and the cartridges per test right now, the proposed retail price is about $75 per cartridge. So, until that technology matures and becomes more available, that's going to be a roadblock to folks who want to do that testing, because none of us are going to buy. Very few people are going. Very few companies are going to buy a $10,000 machine and do the testing. So, it's going to be the collection sites, the concentras, the different collection sites the different document boxes will put those things in there. And then we'll put the equipment in there and then just, do the testing, and we'll have to rely on those collection sites as we have in the past.
There's quite a few questions about getting copies of the deck or recording of this webinar. And we will have a recording I believe we can send it out to everyone because we have everyone's email address. We'll also be posting it onto our website. It's www.screensafeinc.com. There was another question about reasonable suspicion paperwork. Again, that is on the website. And if you look under resources, and then I believe it's documentation, you can put in there what you're looking for as far as reasonable suspicion paperwork.
Let me also add, Lucy, we have updated paperwork on reasonable suspicion that we need to add. And I also want to respond to Christina's question about the research. It's interesting that you asked that question, because the infrastructure bill that's going through Congress now, there is a portion of that bill that deals with marijuana. And the legislation that's in the infrastructure bill would permit researchers, universities and researchers, to buy marijuana from the clinic, from the dispensaries near them, to do their research, which I think is, it makes great sense. Instead of getting something from a farm in Mississippi that may not reflect what's available to the public, being able to go to the dispensary and saying, hey, I want to buy really, there's absolutely zero reason for someone to buy a 90% THC dab. It would be like all of us going to the liquor store and buying Everclear and having that be our beverage of choice. I suppose it's, for some people that might be okay, but it's, but making that possible for researchers to use what people are actually using seems like a great idea. I don't know that that's going to move through Congress, if that's going to stay in there or not, but who knows? Great question. Thank you. I'm sorry, Lucy.
No, that's it. So like I said, we're going to have a link to this webinar on our website. If anybody wants anything else, or you feel free to email me, and I will be happy to make sure that I get it over to you.